Starting off this countdown, we have the corpse collector. Legend has it that a mysterious, deadly person roams around Russia. This person is out stalking individuals to kidnap. After successfully kidnapping them, he will kill them, preserve them, and then display their mummified bodies. As a result, people in Russia were scared to roam the streets at night alone with fear of running into the corpse collector. Now, what's even more terrifying is that in 2011, this urban legend came to life. A man named Anatoly Moskvin was arrested for grave robbing. He would dig up the bodies of females, mummify them, dress them up as dolls, and display them in his home. The dolls were found seated on shelves, sofas, or chairs all throughout his home. Apparently, their faces and limbs were covered in cloth, so you couldn't tell that they were composed of real humans. In fact, his home was shared with his parents, and they were completely oblivious. They just thought that the corpses were large dolls that he created. Quite creepy. Who knows if he was inspired by the corpse collector legend, or if the real corpse collector is still out there somewhere.
Number 4 on this list is Australia's mustard gas experiment. One would think that testing a deadly poisonous gas on people would be kind of a silly and dangerous thing to do, but that's exactly what happened in this science experiment. Top 10's writes, Queensland, Australia set the stage for some awful chemical weapons testing on human subjects. The year 1942 brought Australia into the thick of World War II. Hostilities when Japanese aggression brought more questions than answers about how mustard gas might behave and deliver harm in a tropical climate. The chemical weapon had already been deployed against China by Japan, sparking fears that Australia was next in line. To investigate, human experiments using a gas chamber which was moved from Townsville, Australia to Melbourne on a 3-ton truck were conducted. The trouble is, the danger of mustard gas exposure was underestimated. Over the 3 years to follow, a range of secret tests were done. The research included gas chamber tests involving volunteers who were Australian Armed Forces recruits who apparently did not fully understand the degree of potential harm to which they were getting themselves into. The tropical conditions quadrupled the effects of mustard gas, leaving many with nasty injuries. At Innisfail, volunteers tested how long they could carry on their duties while exposed to burning mustard gas, while 1944 experiments on Northbrook Island saw volunteers dropping into trenches after the island was doused with the deadly substance. Imagine literally joining the army to help your country fight, and then your own country, who you've decided to risk your life for, uses you as a test dummy with mustard gas. These were new recruits who had no idea what was going on, but were just trying to help their country, and then bam! Australia drops a bunch of mustard gas on them and wonders why a lot of them got permanently injured. This one was one of two things. It was either pure stupidity from the Australian government, or it was pure cruelty. Both are bad considering these are the people who run the country making these decisions. Either way, as you can all imagine, the experiment proved that mustard gas is still very dangerous. Number 3 on this list is Frankenstein. Alright, so I know, Frankenstein is a fictional experiment and everything else on this list actually happened, but when it comes to science experiments going wrong, Frankenstein has kind of definitely set the mark here. Frankenstein is the classic novel written by Mary Shelley back in 1818, where a young scientist named Victor Frankenstein decides to organize a science experiment that goes horribly wrong. Well, initially, the experiment actually goes horribly right. We all know the classic line, "It's alive," because the experiment did actually work and the monster did actually come alive. There have been multiple adaptations of this story over the years, with some stories talking about how this monster attacked the village below and incited a mob, but in the original story, the monster actually strangled Victor's future wife. Attacking a village, strangling Victor's lover, neither of these outcomes are good, so ultimately I think it's safe to say that this experiment didn't go as planned. Number 2 on this list is the Stanford prison experiment. This was a psychological science experiment that is often considered one of the worst in history. The study was done in 1971 and was meant to be a 2-week simulation of prison. It was run by Stanford professor Philip Zimbardo and went horribly wrong. Wikipedia says participants were recruited from the local community with an ad in the newspapers offering $15 per day to male students who wanted to participate in a psychological study of prison prison life. Volunteers were chosen after assessments of psychological stability and then randomly assigned to being prisoners or prison guards. Critics have questioned the validity of these methods. Those volunteers selected to be guards were given uniforms specifically to de-individuate them and instructed to prevent prisoners from escaping. The experiment officially started when prisoners were arrested by real Palo Alto police. Over the following 5 days, psychological abuse on the prisoners by the guards became increasingly brutal. After Christina Maslach visited to evaluate the conditions, she was so upset to see how study participants were behaving that she confronted Zimbardo. He ended the experiment on the 6th day. Like the Milgram experiment, SPE has been referenced and critiqued as one of the most unethical psychology experiments in history. The harm inflicted on the participants prompted universities worldwide to improve their ethics requirements for human subject experiments. Other researchers have found it difficult to reproduce the study, especially given those constraints. It truly was extremely brutal, and the fact that it went on for as long as it did is kind of crazy. Many of the people that participated here had long-lasting effects, and this incident changed their lives forever. All for $15 a day just so this sick professor could see that prison ultimately really sucks. And finally, number 1 on this list is Unit 731. Unit 731 was absolutely terrifying and not a group that you wanted to be associated with at all. Basically, this was a group that conducted multiple science experiments on civilians. They were around from the 1930s to the 1940s in the Japanese army. They were led by General Shiro Ishii and were responsible for killing potentially over 200,000 people. These deaths were sometimes purposeful, but mainly they were just a byproduct of the horrible experiments that they were performing. Live Science says numerous diseases were studied in order to determine their potential use in warfare. Among them were plague, anthrax, dysentery, typhoid, paratyphoid, and chlorora, according to a paper by Dr. Robert K.D. Peterson for Montana University. Numerous atrocities were committed, including infecting wells with cholera and typhoid and spreading plague-ridden fleas across Chinese cities. According to Peterson, the fleas were dropped in clay bombs, which were dropped at a height of 200 to 300 meters and showed no trace. Prisoners were marched in freezing weather and then experimented on to determine the best treatment for frostbite. Former members of the unit have told media outlets that prisoners were doused with poison gas, put in pressure chambers until their eyes popped out, and even dissected while alive and conscious. After the war, the US government helped keep the experiment secret as part of a plan to make Japan a Cold War ally, according to the Times report. They were terrible experiments that often failed and resulted in the loss of human life. These experiments were honestly doomed from the beginning and were destined to go horribly wrong.
Jumping in, we have zombie dogs. In 1940, the Soviet Union released a 20-minute long motion picture titled Experiments in the Revival of Organisms. Conducted by a Soviet research group who were focusing on the potential resuscitation of dead organisms, the video shows in great length canines being killed and then brought back to life in various different horrifying ways. Now, I love me some doggos, so I'm not gonna lie, this little bit's gonna be a little bit rough. Credited to Dr. Sergei Brukhanoko and Boris Levinskovsky, the video shows several severed dogs' heads that have been kept alive for hours on end. These poor guys were even wiggling their ears still, licking their mouths, and responding to the humans around them. The two scientists claimed that the animals were kept alive by an artificial blood circulation system. Crazily enough, the doctors developed a new version to be used on humans that very same year, and well, no one really knows what happened after that. The doctors went on to be awarded the prestigious Lenin Prize, although some commentators have questioned the film's authenticity, claiming that the severed dog's head only survived for a few minutes when attached to the artificial heart. So, the real story, no one knows, and it's nasty stuff.
And at number 4, we have the buzzer. Those of you who are well versed in Russian urban legends have probably heard of this one. So there's a Russian radio station that has been broadcasting a buzz since the 1970s. As a result, this radio station was nicknamed the Buzzer. It said that every few months, the buzzing is interrupted with a voice saying UVB76 and then a series of random numbers and words. Then the buzzing continues. No one knows what this means, but there are several theories out there. Legend goes that it's a military communication system, or a dead man switch system in case of a nuclear strike. Maybe the radio station contains a bunch of coded messages for Russian spies, or maybe it is a dead man switch system that can launch a counter-strike in times of nuclear war. Who knows? But it's still a very creepy mystery and urban legend. In our third spot, we have the Black Bird of Chernobyl. In 1986 in Ukraine, an accident in the Chernobyl nuclear power plant caused the reactor to explode. This explosion had lasting effects, and to this day it's still considered the worst nuclear disaster. Well, according to some survivors of this incident, they claim that shortly before the nuclear plant meltdown, they all experienced nightmares, received threatening phone calls, and had encountered a huge winged bird creature. Legend goes that these were all warning signs that the disaster was going to happen. So the bird was described as a large creature like man with huge wings and red eyes. Some even claim that they saw it over one of the reactors as it went through the meltdown. People then drew the connection between this beast and the Mothman of West Virginia. The Mothman apparently showed up right before the Silver Bridge collapsed in 1967. So legend goes that if you see these creatures, then something bad is going to happen. So if you ever do encounter this bird creature, maybe go home and lock yourself inside. Who knows what tragedy will follow. Moving on to number 2, we have the Russian sleep experiment. This started off as a creepypasta, but now some people are convinced that it is in fact a true story. Legend goes that in the 1940s, Russian researchers were conducting unethical tests on enemy prisoners. They captured 5 enemies that they planned to keep awake for 30 days using a gas-based stimulant. They wanted to see the effects that sleep deprivation had on the brain. As a result, they were sealed into a chamber with a promise that if they cooperated, then they would be freed afterwards. For the first 5 days, everything went fine. After these 5 days, that's when it took a dark twist. Eventually, one of the prisoners screamed until he shredded his vocal cords. As each day passed, more terrifying stuff started to happen. When they decided to open the chamber to check on them, they were horrified. The floor was covered in blood and one of the prisoners was dead with some of his flesh scattered throughout the chamber. The other 4 test subjects also had parts of their body torn off, but this wasn't from attacking each other. In fact, it was all self-inflicted. Even some of them had exposed bones and deep wounds. They were then going to be given medical attention, but all the prisoners said that they no longer wanted to be freed. They all kept saying that they just needed the gas that kept them awake. One eventually fell asleep and immediately flatlined. 2 of the other prisoners passed away also. The remaining one went on a rampage. These prisoners that everyone saw was apparently the evil inside the human mind that is kept sane by sleeping. Since they hadn't been sleeping, it unleashed this evil. So yeah, definitely make sure to get at least 6 hours of sleep every night just to be safe. And in our number 1 spot, we have the Curse of the Ivan Vasili. The Ivan Vasili was a ship built around 1897 as a civilian steam freighter for transporting freight across the Baltic Sea. But as war broke out, the ship was repurposed into a military supply ship for the Russian Navy. Now, no one knows what went wrong, but the crew on board all started to feel like they were being watched. They would hear eerie footsteps and would be hit with random cold bursts. They could just feel that something was starting to go wrong. Then, according to the legend, one night all the crew members suddenly went berserk and started fighting each other for no reason. One crew member even jumped overboard and took his own life. There was like a cloud of negativity hanging over the ship. A few days later, another crew member also jumped overboard. But that's not all. Apparently one of the crew members also spotted a ghostly figure appear from a glowing mist, and it just glided across the ship's deck. As a result of all the odd things that kept occurring while aboard this ship, when they reached land, over a dozen men fled the ship. Some were so scared that they even jumped from the ship and swam to shore. Those that remained on board would continue to witness odd things, and more men would jump overboard. It said that some sort of evil force had possessed the ship. As a result, the ship was burned down, but to this day, we don't know what truly happened aboard this ship.
Number 5 on this list is the aviator suit. Back in the early 1900s, flight was on everyone's mind. Flying machines were extremely new and were not very well developed, but scientists wanted to push it further. In this case, the specific scientist in question is Franz Reichelt. Franz Reichelt was designing an aviator suit. This aviator suit is just a fancy name for what we now consider to be a parachute. He folded up a fabric that was roughly 320 square feet and made it into a wearable aviator suit. The idea was exactly what we have now for a parachute. You jump into the air from a high height and then your parachute comes out and you should gently float to the ground. This is great in theory, but it didn't work out that great in practice. Franz had tried his device from the roof of a few buildings, but it never worked. He claimed that it wasn't his invention that was the problem, but the height of the building. So, naturally, we just needed to try it from a higher building. Enter in the Eiffel Tower. Now, up until this point, he was using test dummies to jump off the buildings, and he was all set to do that again for the Eiffel Tower, but last minute, he got a change of heart. Franz was feeling that performance adrenaline and wanted to show off his invention to the crowd below, so he strapped into his suit and leaped off the Eiffel Tower himself. He beautifully floated down to the ground in a picturesque fashion to the sound of crowds cheering and chanting his name. Is what he wanted to happen. What actually happened is that he jumped off, the suit didn't work, and he fell all the way to the ground from the Eiffel Tower. Believe it or not, the landing didn't actually kill him though. He was already dead. Franz had a heart attack before he hit the ground when he realized his suit wasn't gonna work.
Coming in at number 4, we've got underwater cities. In the 1960s, the Soviets decided that land just wasn't enough, so they changed things up a bit and headed underwater. By 1966, the Ichthyander project was well underway by a group of amateur divers at their own site in the Crimea. Well, it seemed that in Soviet Russia, anyone could take a pop at experimental science, and that's exactly what happened. And, well, it was pretty much an unrivaled success. That same year, as part of the project, a human being spent 3 days continuously underwater, held in a small metal structure at the bottom of the Black Sea. It picked up some serious hype, and the underwater project soon attracted the attention of the Soviet science authorities. This led to an even bigger push into the experimental field, and in 1967, the project operated an underwater habitat for over 2 weeks. Mysteriously, after that, Project Ichthyander was abruptly dissolved, but records state that the research led to several other Soviet experiments into underwater habitats, such as Sadko, Chernobyl, and Sprut. These sites actually exist, so kind of makes you think, are they still down there? Next up at number 3, we have the two-headed dog. Man, here's another rough doggo video, but well, sadly, it seems like man's best friend was the test subject of choice in most early hybrid experimentation. Such is the case with Dr. Vladimir Petrovich Demikov. Born in Moscow in 1916, this Soviet scientist dedicated his life's work to what he referred to as transplantology. During the 1930s and 50s, Demikov went on to pioneer several organ transplantations, such that had never been done before in medical science, such as a heart transplant for an animal and a lung to heart transplant. His most messed up transplantation though, hands down, is his research into dog head transplants, of course, which, well, resulted in a two-headed dog experiment. Insanely enough, the experiment was actually a success, and well, he caught a portion of the result on video. Of course, the test subjects sadly didn't survive very long, but this experiment paved the way for other animal head transplants, such as apes. Dr. Demikov's true legacy though was to perform human head transplants. No thank you. And swinging in at number 2, we've got man-monkey hybrids. Yep, you heard that correctly. Born in the small town of Shigri, Ilya Ivanovich Ivanov was a Soviet biologist that was the definition of a real-life mad scientist. Now, in reality, Ivanov's research in other fields led to some pretty groundbreaking stuff, particularly in the field of horse breeding. But his main hang-up was that he was absolutely obsessed with making a human-ape hybrid. As early as 1910, Ivanov had given a presentation on his plans for human-ape life to the World Congress of Zoologists in Graz, where he outlined his plans to create this simian hybrid. So, in the 1920s, Ivanov set about his experiments working with human sperm and female chimpanzees. It didn't work though. but Ivanov was determined. So in 1929 he organised another set of experiments, this time involving ape sperm and human volunteers. The experiments were publicly delayed due to the death of Ivanov's last orangutan, but no one really knows the true outcome of his life's work. In the 1930s, after a political shake-up in the Soviet scientific world, Ivanov was arrested and exiled to Alma-Ata in Kazakhstan, where he later died of a stroke. But who knows whether his legacy lives on in the dark corners of the scientific world. And finally, at our number 1 spot, we have Laboratory 1. In 1921, the Soviet Secret Service, also known as the Cheka, undertook various tests on deadly poisons in an aim to create the perfect biological weapon. In 1939, the small test location was renamed Laboratory 1 and came under the command of notorious Soviet biochemist Grigory Marinovsky. Their objective was the stuff of horrors and set a precedent that would use animals and humans as test subjects to perfect their methods of mass extermination. Marinovsky and his team of scientists would test their poisons on human prisoners from Russian gulags, who they dubbed the so-called enemies of the people. These poisons included mustard gas, ricin, digitoxin and cyanide, and it was given to their victims under the guise of a meal, a drink or even medication that was meant to help them. Eventually these vile experiments led to the development of CT/K2, a poison which caused victims to become calm and silent, then eventually die within 15 minutes. Although Marinovsky was arrested by Joseph Stalin as part of a political science shake-up, his horrific legacy lived on, and Laboratory 1 was reportedly reactivated in the late 1990s as part of a biological and toxin weapons project. Scary stuff, eh?